Hey, Peter.
Hey, good morning, David. Welcome back.
Yes, here we are again. Uh, so, we have an interesting topic for today, beyond the hype, and what are some strategies to make AI really work for you in your organization?
Yeah, no, I think we have a really exciting talk ahead of us, and we have a lot of ground to cover, and a list of items I think we think are important that we'd like to go over and cover in this podcast. And as always, please, we look forward for your feedback. If you have feedback, please post it to us. We try to make these as informative and as useful as possible for you.
Good. Well, let's jump into it. So, Peter, I know one of the things that we talk about amongst ourselves a lot is, what's the delta, the gap between the hype and the reality of implementing AI? What do you think? I mean, is there hype today?
Well, I think like any new technology, there's a massive amount of hype. But that said, there's also a massive amount of potential, but you have to know how to use it. You have to know how to use it effectively. Of course, the hype always gets ahead of everybody else. Oh, you can do all this, and it's the reality is there are things that you have to do if you want to get the most benefit out of the technology to really do some game-changing things with it. Right.
Yeah. But I think your point is we're not talking about flying cars here, right? We're not at the flying cars level of hype where I think since I was a kid I've been waiting for flying cars to arrive. AI is real, the power is real, but there is some hype.
Yes, exactly. Well,
All
that's
right.
normal. Any kind of new product out there, you're going to have some level of hype. It's going to go through the normal innovation curve where lots of hype, come back down to reality a little bit before people really start to appreciate and understand the limitations and the capabilities and how to maximize it. And I think we're getting there.
Yeah, no, we definitely are. So we put our heads together before the podcast and we came up with a list of 9 key strategies that will hopefully help people cut through some of the hype and really make sure that their AI implementations are effective and live up to the real promise. So I'm going to list those 9, just run through the list of what we call them, and then
Yep.
we'll go back and talk about each of them one at a time. So without further ado, number 1 is make it unique. Number 2 is introduce your data. Number 3 is understand your data. Number 4 is start small. Number 5 is model the costs. Number 6 is think about your company culture. Number 7 is measure the impact. Number 8 is monitor execution of your AI. And number 9 is don't forget to focus on AI safety and ethics. All of
Hmm.
these are really important, but we're going to go back and dissect or decompose these one at a time. So
Right.
let's go back to number 1. Make it unique. Peter, what do we mean when we say make it unique?
I think what we're talking about here is make it unique to your specific business problem. Let's focus on your business problem, your industry. That's what you should do. Let's not just have a generic case, and the tools today facilitate a lot of solving generic problems. But if you want to get the real value out of AI, you really have to make it applicable to your specific business problem. When you say that, true, David?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, there are some values that you can get. You can extract some value out of using generative AI, for example, as a personal assistant, right? And that's
Right.
great. But to really go deeper and to get the real value, you can't use a commodity tool. You're not going to get competitive advantage by using an off the shelf tool or model the same way that anybody else could. So to your point about
Correct.
making it unique, you've got to introduce context and knowledge about your company, your space, your expertise, etc., and create something that is a moat of some sort that prevents your competitors from just copying what you're doing.
Right. I think that's spot on. And it goes back, I think, to any new technology. In order to get the most value out of it, you really have to learn how to apply it to your business problems. Now, I think, and
Right.
David, you and I've spoke about this a million times, and this is where AI is very different than most other technologies out there, is that you really have to, I think, understand the business problem, the business domain a lot more, because that's where the real value comes from. It's having that level of business knowledge and that domain knowledge, because very often some of the problems that you're going to want to work on or apply the technology to are the heavier, more complex business problems. And that's what we say by unique. These are things that are generic or specific to your business. And the question is,
Yes.
how do you get there?
Yep, that's a really good point. So I think that probably is the most fundamental starting place for a lot of companies is figure out where you'll apply AI in a way that is applying it to something that's proprietary, unique, or differentiating about your company. And this is such a rapidly changing field that if you don't do that, there's very little barrier to entry for a competitor to clone your approach. Um,
100%. And like
okay.
you said, you mentioned earlier, what's the difference between both of us using the exact same foundation models, which have been trained on the exact same data and asking very similar questions, we're going to get similar responses. It's not, I mean,
Yeah.
yes, that'll get you started, but that's not really where you want to go, and that's not where you want to end up.
I'm reminded of a company that we talked to last year, Peter, and like my favorite parlor trick, and a lot of other people's favorite parlor trick in the early days of generative AI was saying things like, "Hey, create an itinerary for a 4-day visit to Greece, or give me an
Right.
itinerary for a long weekend in New York, or something," right? And generative AI was very good at coming back with these great sounding itineraries, but you couldn't build a business on that because anybody
No.
with access to a browser could generate the exact same itinerary or very similar, right?
And this was exactly what we said at the time. If you truly want to be unique, and you and I have been on this from the very beginning when we first started doing this and we first started having the conversations, was, and it's because of our backgrounds. You and I have done this work for decades. You really have to be a key differentiator. You have to make yourself different. If you really truly want a competitive advantage and have a lot of value and get a lot of values out of these tools, you have to understand how to maximize their capabilities and use your own information and your own data to get the results that you want, which will give you a competitive advantage. And again, if you and I have travel agencies and we're asking the same questions, we're going to get similar answers. That's not making us any different.
Yep. But if you find a way to take the accumulated years of knowledge, experience, and wisdom that your team possesses and
Right.
put that into your AI solution, now you're talking about uniqueness. You're talking, it may be the same purpose, it may be generate a trip itinerary, but if you can do it in
Right.
a way that takes advantage of that secret sauce that your organization has, that's how you create uniqueness. Which is a
Exactly.
great segue to number two on our list.
Going to
But
say.
before we go there, we did have one question from the live audience. The question is, are the birds that we hear in the background real or AI generated, Peter?
They are very real. I didn't think that. I thought they would get filtered out, but they are very real.
Okay, good. So no AI trickery going on here.
Yeah, no,
Um,
this is the real background. As most of you can tell, I am not sitting normally where I sit. I am sitting someplace a little bit further south for a little
that,
while.
that,
So yes, this is the noises are real.
that's not snowy New Jersey. Okay, good.
No,
Um, so back to our list. Number two on our list was introduce your data, and really where this comes in is the number one way to make your AI solution unique is to introduce your data. So let's talk about, what does that mean to introduce your data into your AI solution?
so let's go back to that example, David, that you brought up at the very beginning, the one that you and I had spoken about approximately a year ago. um, the travel agency and making it unique. And how do you make your solution unique? You bring your own data to the party. You use your own information. Every company has their own information. Small businesses, large businesses, whatever. You you save virtually everything that you have. Everything that we do these days is saved somewhere, whether it's emails, it's text, it's documentation, it's whatever it may be. It's all the databases we have. The issue I think for a lot of companies is they don't recognize and understand what they have and how they could possibly use it, which is where you and I come in and say, hey, you do have this. Let's use this. Let's incorporate this information into your models. All of a sudden, you're going to have things that are custom for your business. Right?
Right. And that's a great point. I think the real value that generative AI has unlocked is to
Right.
turn all of those documents, which have just been static documents clogging up your shared drives and your
Right.
inboxes and everything else, to turn those from documents to actual accessible, usable data.
Right. Now, how do you do that? What would you suggest? I mean, there's obviously a lot of ways to do this, but what would you suggest?
Well, so good question. I think, as you said, there are a lot of ways to do it. There have been a lot of ways to do it for a long time. The problem was they weren't very cost effective. They weren't very reliable. They weren't very cost effective. Going back years, I could certainly try to create proprietary models that would parse PDF documents and extract text by recognizing the characters. And I could have other models that would try to classify those documents to tell me what they were, and still other custom models that would extract specific types of information from those documents. But that was, as you and I both experienced, many years ago, that was incredibly painful, expensive. It was a long process. Now you can do it easily. So I think, when I think of introducing your data in the context of generative AI, I think of sort of three buckets of things. I think of presenting documents as part of the context of a query that you're making in generative UI. I think about that in terms of techniques like retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, that we can talk about. And ultimately, I think about fine-tuning of models as sort of the end goal for a lot of organizations. Does that list make sense? Do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think they all make sense, and I think the thing organizations have to think about these days, and you had mentioned it in the past when I was parsing apart through, say, PDF documents, or maybe it was Word or some of these unstructured every organization has a lot of unstructured information. Using that information effectively was always very difficult. Parsing apart PDFs was a problematic, difficult process to go through. Tagging fields in the documents was difficult to go through. Technology has gotten to the point now where it's so sophisticated that I can extract information from this unstructured information and use it effectively, and the cost has dropped dramatically to do that. In the past,
Yeah.
and this even goes back to the old classic, look about a travel agency, extracting information from voice content, for instance, doing speech to text or vice versa, because that's valuable information to incorporate. You want to include that information. The tools have gotten so sophisticated and so good at extracting content and actionable data from all this unstructured information that you can now use it very effectively in ways that you were very difficult. The bar was very high and it was very costly to do in the past. And as you had said, David, there's a bunch of methodologies and approaches to use this, some easier and quicker than others, some requiring more compute and more work, like fine tuning or even training a model from scratch for yourself. But there are ways to use it effectively, very effectively, and get a lot of value out of this information, depending on your business case and what you're trying to do.
Perfect. Let's do a couple of made-up examples. Maybe I'll start with something around context. So let's pretend that I run a company, and Peter, you're a customer, and you've just sent me a very long, wordy email in response to my thank you for your order email that I sent you. Now, if I want to use generative AI to understand what you're actually saying, I could simply take the text of your email and paste it into my query or my prompt to a generative AI engine and say, what's Peter's mood? What suggestions does Peter have for me? And does Peter have any complaints or issues? Now, to be clear, if I ask that question without pasting your email, I could just go to a generative AI tool and say, how does Peter like product XYZ? And that tool would either have no idea or more likely would make up some completely fictitious answer, but it wouldn't be based on the email you sent me. But if I paste the text of that email into my prompt in the most crude, I'm giving an example, in the most crude way possible, right? Just paste it in. And now I say, what does Peter think about my product? I'm going to get real answers based on your email, right? That's part of my prompt. That's the context of my prompt. And there are ways to automate that, to mechanize that process so that you could, for every time you ask a question, you could also attach to your question some context, a document, a transcript, an audio file, a video file, or a collection of those that are going to be part of the answer that AI gives you. So that's context. That's one way of doing it, right?
No, that's an excellent example of having context. And I think, even taking, a little bit step further, having context or domain knowledge about my business, because maybe the terminology that we use is somewhat unique and different than generally accepted. So including that context, whether through a prompt or through fine tuning a model or whatever it may be, will score, so to speak, that email even with a higher degree of accuracy.
So, that's a great point. The more context you can provide, the more background information effectively you're giving the model to create a response. And the more accuracy, the more precision you're going to get out of that response.
Right. And I think, generally that is just providing context. That phrase says a lot. It's very important to keep in mind. And there are many different ways to provide context. And some are more cost effective than others, depending on the problem that you're trying to solve. Some are cost effective over a much larger data set, for instance, of something you're going to do, very often, or some are just quick to do and get a response without having to, like, say, fine tune a model.
Yep. Okay, so moving up the stairs to the next level solution, right? And again, this is all under the context of introduce your data, item 2 on our magic list of 9 strategies.
Right.
Sometimes you've just got way too much available context to introduce into every AI conversation, and you need a way to select or selectively include context into the question you're asking of AI. That's effectively what retrieval augmented generation is, right?
Right. Right. Right, exactly. It's pulling back content that's relevant to the question that you're actually asking it. And you might have, I don't know, tens of millions of records, for instance, for argument's sake, or tens of millions of PDFs from which you've extracted information, but only a subset of them are relevant. And that's where RAG comes in very handy. And that's just a
Yeah.
methodology or an approach for identifying documents that are relevant to the type of query that you're asking based off of a whole bunch of, full sophisticated pattern matching algorithms,
Right.
for lack of a better way of describing it.
Okay, so you're taking a library of potential context, and with every question that gets asked, you're sort of retrieving the slices of that you think will be relevant context to that question, and
Correct.
bundling that up with the original question and getting a better answer
Right.
from your model. Great.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right.
Good.
Right, exactly. And I think maybe, and it's funny, you and I are throwing out a lot of terminology, and I think maybe it's a little important to just give a little bit more information. Context, and when we say context in a model, there's a concept of a context window. Think of it as, I think of it, and you and I have described it as short-term memory passed into the model to drive an outcome. So you're passing in all this additional information into the model to effectively control the weights in the model to generate an output.
I'm really glad you used the short-term memory analogy because it's a really important distinction. In everything we've talked about to date here, whether it's context or retrieval augmented generation and various flavors of that, the key thing is it's short-term memory, and as soon as you're done with that conversation, the model forgets it. So the model isn't changed. Your AI is not learning from these interchanges and from this context. If you took away the context and you asked another question, it would be the same dumb model it was before you gave it any context.
That's correct.
However, your favorite technique for introducing data is a way around that problem. And of course, I'm
Right.
speaking about fine tuning.
Right. Now, this is where you take all the information, and let's now go back to short and long-term memory. You're taking short-term memory and you're basically making it into long-term memory. So a model, when it's trained, is obviously trained on a corpus of information. And what I mean by that, it's trained on a lot of information, in many cases for the foundational models, corpuses of information that are publicly available. Websites, books, scientific literature, whatever, they decide to put into the model, and they curate, clean up, put into the model. Now, if I have a specific domain, maybe a very, what is a lot of very specific domain type knowledge that is most likely not in that model, maybe travel for argument's sake, maybe it's generating repair instructions for appliances. That's very specific knowledge. Now, taking that information, incorporating it permanently into the model itself, effectively making the original model smarter to my domain by including all that information in the model, by fine tuning it, so to speak. Next time I go in, I don't have to pass all that information into the context, the prompt, to get the response that I would. So it makes it faster. And when you're doing this on a very large scale, if you're, for instance, querying the model millions of times, you're going to drive the costs down dramatically because you're not passing information into the model every single time.
So is it almost safe to say that if an off-the-shelf large language model is like a liberal arts undergrad, it has a broad base of knowledge, and by fine-tuning, what you're doing is sending that model to graduate school, and you're introducing additional specialized knowledge. And if someone goes to graduate school in a discipline, it's not making them extra capable in other disciplines, but you're giving them a lot of specialized knowledge in a particular field based on what you fine
Yeah.
tune them on.
Exactly. And it's funny because there was a problem that we were working on, and I was working with one of our engineers, and I said, basically, I'm going to give a model an engineering degree because the problem that we were working on really kind of required that level of background information in order to come up with some accurate answers. So I was like, well, we're going to have to teach it how to be a mechanical engineer, basically, in a nutshell.
Right.
And that's,
Excellent.
otherwise we're passing all that information in every single time. And that drives up the costs.
Excellent.
So we have
So,
a question in the chat. I'm sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead. I'm
yeah,
sorry.
go ahead.
No,
Let's
there's a
do it.
question that popped up in a chat. I don't know if we want to answer it now or later, and maybe it's one of the later questions, but just putting it out there, how do we quantify ROI of AI investments? I think that's an excellent
Mhm.
question. I also think it's a
Yeah.
hard question to answer. So why don't we, you correct me if you don't want to, let's do it now, David, or we can wait till the very end and maybe we jump into that.
Let's talk about that as we get into some of the other items on our list, because we have an item around the investment, the cost, and you've referred to that a couple of times. And your choice of how you introduce data into a model does directly impact the cost. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about how you measure the impact of the model. So
Right.
let's dive into those components of ROI as we get to them, and hopefully by doing that, we'll address this question.
Okay.
All right. So,
So,
so we talked about making a model unique. We talked about doing that by introducing your data. And key strategy number 3, though, is it's not quite that easy to just introduce your data. You have to understand your data. What are the
right.
challenges in that? What do you need to know about your data to really be able to bring it to bear on an AI problem?
I'll start with the most basic problems, and then I'm going to jump to you because this is an area you are far better versed than I am. Knowing even what you have, I think, is challenge number one. I think most organizations, and again, you and I have been on customer calls and we're asking questions, and they'll say something. Well, we go into this system, and we go into this system, and it never really occurs to them that that information might be incredibly valuable in training a model or coming up with any kind of AI solution. So I think just first identifying what you have and being able to,
Right.
I say, catalog it. Cataloging is the right word. Whether you use cataloging tools or not, but really understand what is available. And I think as you go through your domain or your business or the problem that you're trying to solve, it's asking those questions. Like, what are you doing today? And where is that information getting persisted? And can I get to that information?
Yeah, it's funny because I think for people who haven't ever tried to get access to some of the less frequently used data in their organizations, that probably sounds pretty trivial. But as you said, Peter, just knowing what you've got, where it is, and how to get access to it can be, I'll be generous, I'll say non-trivial. It can be incredibly
Correct.
difficult.
And I
Yeah,
think even we say small businesses or SMBs or, but those can be businesses that are up, billion, $2 billion in revenue that are not very good. They probably don't even manage the data first off, and they have data scattered in, tens or hundreds or even potentially thousands of databases and applications skewed, all across their organization. And they don't really understand what they have. And things might be replicated 5 times and all over the place, and the quality might be suspect, and things that, you take for granted are just not there. The processes aren't in place, but going through and really identifying what is it that I need that can make this better is a
yeah.
challenge for
Hey,
most places. It's not easy.
absolutely. And that challenge is amplified by what you said earlier, which is the type of data that we're talking about is often not the data that has been the most carefully managed at an organization. So organizations with an IT department probably are taking at least a certain level of care around managing databases full of customer information and transactions and order history and things like that. But they have a huge wealth of information that might be in emails, internal emails, and emails from
Right.
customers. It might be in their CRM system. It might be in customer service chat logs and call logs. And
Right.
until very recently, that unstructured information really flew under the radar for a lot of people. Yes, they thought about,
Right.
yes, we have an email archive, but they really hadn't thought about the potential to go and extract knowledge from those documents and those emails and things. And
Right.
as we said at the beginning, generative AI suddenly has made that economically feasible to do.
Right. And let's even something even very germane. It's, again, we are our digital footprint in any organization is incredibly large. Outside of Slack messages and text messages and emails and conference calls, which is all highly relevant and very important, but generation of presentations, generation of documents, information stored on maybe software development processes. All this information, traditionally non-standard, very hard to mine information from. But now
Yeah.
with the tooling, it's very easy to pull information from these, again, traditionally non-standard data sources. Like think of just even a PowerPoint presentation. How much information is potentially embedded in that, between images and content itself. Extracting information from that now is eminently doable for a not a high cost. And using that and incorporating that is, again, something most people, unless they understand the capabilities of the tools, are not going to look at. Where you and I will go,
Yeah.
oh, we can use that and get a lot of value out of it.
Very, really good point. And it's, so finding that information, knowing how to get your hands on it is a huge challenge. And then it's really interesting because you mentioned like these PowerPoints and emails and things. And that sort of also begs the question about once you found it, how do you know if it's any good? Because if it's like most organizations, you have lots of emails, some of which are full of factually correct statements and some of which are full of incorrect statements. You have multiple versions of PowerPoint, some of which are up to date and some are out of date, and some were rejected because the ideas were not good ideas, etc. So there's a quality question. Once you solve the how do I know what I have and find it and get my hands on it, now you have to say, I don't know if it's any good.
Right. And as you and I say all the time, garbage in, garbage out. When you train these models, if you're going to use this information, you want to make sure that you at least have good, decent quality data. And again, I will defer to you on this one because at least in my experience, there's not a very good answer, I think, very often for some of this and being able to go through it and identify the quality of the information that's there.
Yeah. No, unfortunately, this is where some of the hard work really comes in, right? There's no magic bullet for making sure that you only use good data, good quality data. And the other interesting part about it is even the definition of good data or good enough data, which is really where the bar should be,
Mhm.
is very dependent upon how you're using it. So information
Right.
that you would use to create a long range strategic forecast has to have a certain level of goodness to it. But if you are
Right.
using that same information to create external financial reports to file a 10K or a 10Q, you suddenly need the accuracy and reliability of that data to be even higher. So
Right.
um,
Correct.
the battle is not a binary, is the data good or not? Is it high quality or not high quality? It's really how do I want to use it and how good does it need to be, which means you need to start looking at metrics around the defects, around the consistency, the integrity, the accuracy of that data. Um, so
Right.
there's a whole discussion we could have, and maybe someday we will spend an hour just talking about data quality. Uh, but
No.
quality is a big issue. Um,
No. You hit the nail on the head. Quality is an issue, and it's also more difficult when you're applying it to the non-standard, unstructured data sources. I think you and I come from financial backgrounds, so putting heuristics or metrics or even rules around financial information is a little bit. It's easier to do.
yeah,
But when you're speaking about some of this other type of information, again, like you said, quality it's subjective in nature. It really depends, especially for a lot of this, and you have to be careful. Um,
yeah,
what
yeah.
you do, how you apply the rules you apply.
And there's other challenges with data too, and we won't spend a lot of time on these. But once you understand how to get it, you understand the quality. You also need to be thinking about things like privacy. Is there any confidential or personal information, and how do you make sure that you're not
Right.
exposing or sharing that inappropriately within your company, or even worse, outside of your company?
Right.
There's legal issues, copyright issues, and intellectual property and ownership issues. And, certainly we have all been following a variety of court cases around establishing whether fair use doctrine in the US, for example, applies to training models with data. So
Right.
it will suffice it to say that understanding your data is not a check mark that you say, yes, I understand it. It's a process. It's a lot of work has to go into that.
And just one more thing, and maybe we close this and move on to some of the other um, questions. And I forgot where I was going to go with this all of a sudden. This is really a non-trivial process, and I think it's important for an organization to really understand and appreciate the necessity of having a handle on your information. And this is a topic that you and I have spoken about at length to virtually everybody we speak to, how important it is to have a handle on your information to really get the
Yeah,
most out of all of this.
yeah, absolutely. Uh, all right, let's move on then to number 4 on our list. Start small. This is hardly the only situation which people would advise you to start small, but what does start small mean in the context of building an AI solution, Peter?
Find the smallest project or use case that will give you some real tangible value. And that value, when I describe value, value can be failure as much as a success. But really kind of help you. There's a couple of things here. One, it'll help educate, on the capabilities of some of these models, in terms of good and bad. Like there are cases where we've walked in and, we've had people tell us use AI, and I'm like, no, that's not the answer. And go ahead and prove that. But start with a small, tangible project that maybe you can get done in 6 to 8 weeks. At least that's what we try to go for. These projects where you learn as much as you possibly can, because what gets exposed, the quality of your data, very often. What you don't know, what you do know, is this POC even, or what we're trying to solve, even solvable with the technologies that stands today, and you learn a lot
Yeah.
out of all of this.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I think we very much embrace a test and learn approach to this, and that starting small can be, as you said, the scope of the project, and it also can be the solution architecture. We might start with a less elegant solution architecture until we learn more about how the tool will be used and how it will perform, and then introduce later maybe the more robust version of the technical underpinnings of a solution.
right. And I come from the engineering school of fail fast. I am not
Yeah,
but I like to start small and evolve things. Like every system I've ever worked on over my decades of software development have started as small endeavors, small teams, 3, 4 developers. And over many years, they've grown to much larger teams and much more complexity. And I believe that. But when you start from a point of complexity, the chances of failing go up exponentially. So to me, it's always critical start on something that's small and from which it can grow. And that doesn't mean, look, I know some people like to say POCs are a throwaway. I don't view them as that. I view them as very valuable tools from which I can grow. And maybe the very beginnings of an architecture from which I can enhance and grow and put more around it. They don't have to be throwaway, nor do you go into them thinking, "Oh, this is throwaway." But we view them very different. But I like the idea of failing fast.
yeah.
It's not costly to do that.
Failing fast is great, and you mentioned that sometimes an unsuccessful attempt at a project is just as valuable a learning experience. But there's an implication of this, which is you're only failing fast, and learning from failure only works if you're actually paying attention to what you're doing and you're learning from it. So we
Right.
see a lot of organizations that say, well, it only costs a relatively small amount for me to enable AI tools for people across my company. I'm just going to let everyone in the company experiment. Let them come up with as many ideas as they can and try them out, and we'll see what sort of green shoots emerge. How do you feel about that approach?
I'm not a fan. I never have
Yeah,
been a fan of that. And I've encountered that uh, approach numerous times. And one going back to, and I just segue for a second on something a little bit different. I was working in the bank, and this was when analytics were really becoming quite the rage at many places. Doing much more, we call them social analytics, and applying statistics to some of this. And one of the banks I was working at said, "Well, we're going to create a curated set of information. In this case, it was trading information, and we're going to see what people can find from it." Now, mind you, when you send a curated set of trading information to a lot of individuals who know nothing about trading, they come up with some really interesting things that are totally senseless. And I don't like that approach. I think it is
yeah,
always much more productive if you know the problem you're trying to solve and you focus on that problem. Now, I do want to caveat one thing here, and I think it's important, and I don't want to let this one slide by. It's start small is important. I'll put a little addendum beneath that, a little lemma. Um, Start important. Make sure it's something of
yeah,
value. Don't make it something trivial because And I've seen this in some of the companies that we've worked with where they will do a POC, and they'll use one of the traditional foundational models and they go, oh, this is great, it's getting the results I want, without understanding the business problem that they're trying to solve in totality. That if they actually even did something as costing this out, they would realize what might work on in this little trivial thing is going to cost them 20 million, literally 20 to 30 million dollars to implement in the real world, and it makes no sense because their budget is a $500,000. You have to be
Yeah,
thoughtful about it and do the right type of small project to get the right results.
I think that's a very good addendum to our start small principle. And I think you're right. It's sometimes the fact that a project is small can lead people to think that it doesn't matter then if the cost of doing a project is low, why don't I just loosen up the controls and let anybody that wants to do a small project do a small project? And as you said, you run the risk of creating projects that have no value to the business or that have an undeterminate value, or projects that look like they're interesting but actually couldn't scale. Maybe they're too expensive to
Right.
run at scale. Um,
Right.
we saw lots of cases in the early days of generative AI where customers were not our customers, sorry, companies were standing up chatbots that were customer facing chatbots. And obviously, we all saw the news stories about the chatbots giving erroneous or inflammatory responses. But the thing that flew under the radar a little bit was what was just as big a problem was that the companies that did this didn't fully understand the costs of running the solutions the way they built them. And
Right.
they were turning on chatbots that might cost them, in some cases, $2, $3, $4 or more per customer interaction. And if you had hundreds of thousands of customers trying out your new chatbot the first month, you suddenly had millions of dollars of unplanned cost
Right.
associated with this small project that maybe only took someone a couple of weeks to develop.
Right. And I encountered a couple of these as well where, um, those not deeply in knowledge, don't have the knowledge of how these models actually work and what they did. And they ran some simple test cases for smaller companies, and the results came back okay. With they thought it was promising, and just a simple the back of the napkin calculation, based on something like token counts. And I said, look, you take token counts and you calculate the cost for one of the providers out there, one of the cloud providers, and you rapidly realize what you're proposing is going to cost 15, $20 million each and every single run. That this is economically unfeasible. And I
Yeah.
think, and I want to make a little bit of a plug here for you and me both, because we do teach a class, and I think a lot of the information that we're speaking about, a lot of this background information is extraordinarily important to making the right decisions when it comes to using AI effectively in a business and having a certain working knowledge of these models and how they operate for business users is incredibly important to making the right decisions.
Yeah. Thank you for the plug. And thank you for the masterful segue into item number 5 on our list, which is model the costs. Know the costs of your solution and model how it's going to grow
Right.
as the solution grows. So let's talk about cost modeling and how that works.
So you and I take a very engineering approach to, I think, a lot of these things, which is when we take an engineering approach, but with also the business experience. And I think which there is always constraints on when you solve a problem. And I think and I will say we aged here a little bit. You and I come from an era when there was some real practical constraints on the capabilities of the tools that we were using and memory and everything else. You were working on a computer that had maybe, I don't know, 4 gig of memory at the time for a large computer. Had very little power. So we were very aware of the constraints when we coded. We knew what the capabilities of the machine were and how far we can push it. And then today, that's kind of gotten away from a lot of developers, and because for all intents and purposes, using the cloud appears to be horizontally scalable, computer scalable. It's not free; it's just scalable. So they don't model out there, and I've seen a lot of developers do this. They don't model out that big constraint, cost. And that is the number one constraint. The customer comes to us and says, I have a $200,000 budget. Well, that's going to make it very different than a customer that says, maybe I have a $10 million budget, and how I approach and try to solve that problem.
Yeah, that's a really key point. And I think, for people who haven't implemented these in a corporate setting, a lot of people are familiar with the fact that you can pay, $20 a month or some similar fee to get access at a personal level to
Right.
a large language model. When you start doing this at a corporate level, because that $20, whether you've ever hit the limits or not, it comes with limits. There are limits to how many interactions you can have per day and how
Right.
much context you can provide and things like that. When you do this at a corporate level, you are paying by the drink. You are paying, technically, most hosted models are charging by the token. Let's
Right.
consider that a word. And those words include all the words in your questions, all the words that get generated in your answers, and all the words that are part of the context that you provide. And so, Peter, to your point, that word count goes up pretty quickly. And it's a
Right.
fraction of a cent per word if you look up the listed prices. But
But
those words add up very quickly.
you might sit there and upload a PDF, not thinking twice about it, or you might upload 5 PDFs. Maybe you're doing some analysis on a company or some research on a company, and you pull up all the SEC documents. So you pull up, 6 years of, 10Qs and 8Ks and 8Qs, and you upload them into your model. All of a sudden, you're using 500,000 tokens, not even realizing, and you haven't even asked the question yet.
Right. And this is how companies got into a situation where, they could test for pennies an AI chatbot that was customer facing. But when you multiply that by repeated interactions with a chatbot and scale that out to thousands or tens of thousands of customers, suddenly what looked like a negligible cost became a substantial cost.
Very quickly. And so you might say, well, how do I make this less expensive? How do I figure this out? What do I do? And, there are obviously solutions to making this less expensive. And, um, and then the easier, none of which are particularly easy answers, but there are ways of making it less expensive. But it goes back to, engineering a solution, understanding the problem you're trying to solve, understanding how much
Right.
you want to scale it out, how many people are using it, the complexity of your model, what kind of response time you're looking for. Are you looking for 1,000 people using it concurrently or 2 people using it concurrently? Understanding all of these things are imperative to really modeling out the costs, to get a grip or a handle on what it's going to cost you to run it in an
Yeah.
environment. And I think keeping in mind, and then I'll stop talking, is the training aspect of it is a cost, but that in some sense is a finite cost. What really drives the costs up over time are the inferencing costs. And I think we can't forget that. But that's really where the costs are.
And the inferencing costs are the cost of people using the model, people asking
Right.
questions and getting answers back. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There is definitely a trade-off between spending cost up front to configure and train and fine-tune a solution versus cost on the back end. And if you look at our examples earlier on, using context, it costs very, very little to introduce context into a model in terms of upfront setup time and cost. But you're paying a lot more when you introduce that
Right.
context. You're paying a large per token cost at use time or inferencing time. Retrieval
Right.
augmented generation costs more to configure, but one of the side benefits is you're presenting a more carefully selected subset of your context to the model, and therefore you could be lowering your inferencing costs over time because you're not giving it all of your context. You're giving it a select subset of context for each individual interaction. And then fine
Right.
tuning is, maybe the other extreme where you're spending much more upfront time and hours and associated costs with fine tuning a model, but you don't introduce as much context into that model. And in some cases, it means that you're not paying by the drink for inferencing. You're simply paying to host a model somewhere,
Right.
and you have, more, not quite unlimited, but you have less constraints on how much you use the model.
Right.
I think the important part is there will be, for every use case, and it goes back to what you said, Peter, about having an engineering view, there will be a number of inflection points where at a certain level of usage, number of users, number of queries, amount of
Right.
context, etc., at a certain level of usage, it will be less expensive to take a different approach. And
Right.
understanding and predicting where those inflection points will be and monitoring your costs is absolutely essential to prevent this from being like a runaway cost scenario.
100%. And I think, the tools in many ways, especially the ones that are available for the consumers, are very simple to use. But again, when you're applying this in a business context, it's very different. And it's imperative to really model out what you're trying to do and take a very engineering approach to solving it. And I think that's the key thing here. You have to take a very engineering approach to solving these problems. And you and I have been speaking about this for, I want to say, almost a year, about small language models and fine-tuned models are going to be critical to most organizations over time.
Yes.
That you're getting
Yes.
around with the foundational models, they're great for a whole class of problems, but for really domain-specific things, which are going to be key differentiators, you're really going to want to fine-tune your models with
In
your own
fact,
domain
let's make
specific.
a point. Let's make a point to do a future episode just around task specific models and how you get them, and we can talk about fine tuning and distillation and other
Yeah,
relevant topics. Hey,
yeah.
we had a question come in from a viewer. It's around how does this concept we talk about the short term memory, and how does that work when you want to scale up and you want to go to a more custom solution that is introducing your specialized knowledge into the model. So how do you go from using context to fine tuning a model? Do you have to start over again? What happens there?
Okay, not a formulaic answer. I mean, yes, you can start with the old approach. Well, the approach I think most start out with, which was, we call prompt engineering for lack of a better way. It's passing all the information into a prompt. And it goes back to, again, I think you have to kind of model out the cost and what are the inflection point and how much information you're passing into the context window every single time. And at some point, you're going to make a decision that it's going to be more cost effective to fine tune a model and do it that way. And there are the benefits of doing that as well. Remember,
Yeah.
every time you pass in I think it's important, you pass in a context window. And a lot of the models these days have very large context windows, some cases up to 1 and 2 million tokens. The model has to process all that information every single time. It's got to pass it through potentially hundreds of layers in a model. That's costly, that's expensive, that's time consuming. It's not instantaneous. Again, you have to go back. I go back, every problem is unique. So you start after asking yourself some questions. If it's a one off, fine. If it's something I'm doing 10 times a day, maybe fine. If it's something I'm doing 1,000 times a day, now maybe I need to think about taking that information and I'm passing it into a model every time, persisting it or making it permanent knowledge by fine tuning a model so I'm not passing it in every time and doing
Yeah.
that instead.
And there is a saving grace here if you plan ahead and you have the foresight, which is that all of that context that your users brought to their interactions with the model
Right.
does not have to be lost when you decide to go and fine tune a model at a later stage. So we said that the model does not learn from those interactions. The model does not ever change and it forgets everything. That's accurate. But the cheat code in this is that you can retain the history of those conversations. You can retain the context, the documents, the quotes, the emails, and everything that was brought to those conversations by users in your organization. And you can use it to fine tune a model in the future. Now, the model isn't learning when you're just introducing context to conversations with the model. But you absolutely can track and retain the history of those conversations so that you can use that
Mm.
as a starting place for fine tuning your model. So
Right.
it's not back to your premise at the beginning. There's no formulaic easy way to do this, but you aren't if you know that this is a potential thing that you want to do in the future, fine tuning a model or creating some specialized model, you can take steps to ensure that you are retaining some of the context and even the outputs that you got from the
Right.
model, and you
Right.
can preserve that knowledge so that you can use that when it's time to fine tune a model.
Yes. Absolutely agree. And I think this is where experience comes in very handy in understanding all of this and being able to apply it to any solution.
Yep, yep. That's a great point because you need to know that that's a thing you might want to do in the future so that you start saving that context. All too often, people don't
Right.
plan ahead and end up wishing they had a record of how the models were used or what context was introduced into them. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point. And I maybe kind of reiterate on the hype aspect of AI a little bit. I think a lot of things people have gotten ahead of. Um, they want to do things that the models are it's that are very hard to do in some of these models without understanding how complex it actually is to do
Yeah.
solve some of these problems.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's move down our list to the next one. We talked about modeling the cost. Next is thinking about your culture, because at the end of the day, a fantastic model is only as good as the way people use it, right?
Right. Oh yes. And I think, and you and I have said this a million times, AI is different. Look, there have been obviously a number of major breakthroughs in the last 25 years that you and I have been through. And I think from the advent of the internet, first client server technology, then the advent of the internet, and then subsequently smartphones. And, we've gone through these cycles many times. And in many cases, they are automations of existing processes. And what I mean by that is they're taking part of the processing and they're making it more efficient. They're not necessarily replacing, we'll call it more I would say white collar thinking, but for lack of a better way of describing it, um, those types of jobs. So, knowledge workers, those types of things. Now AI all of a sudden can replace knowledge workers. So you really have to think hard about when I'm approaching a business problem, what are the implications on my culture, on my business culture? How are people going to deal with this? Are they going to feel threatened by it or are they not? Like, what is the answer to that? What is the best approach when you're investigating some of these technologies that could potentially replace whole processes?
Yeah, yeah, it's fascinating because people who are threatened or scared of AI or just poorly informed about how it really works, they might refuse to engage with it at all. And if they
Right.
do engage with it, we see behaviors at across the whole spectrum. And in some cases, you have people who might use AI or might be in a position where AI is creating suggestions or content or answers, and they don't trust it enough. They don't want to use those answers, and they ignore AI because maybe it goes counter to their training or their conventional wisdom or their experience. Um,
Right.
and sometimes that's good, sometimes it's bad. But if they're always ignoring AI, then you might have built the perfect model, but it's having no impact on your organization.
Right. And so, what is the answer, Ben? How do you're walking into a new company, and I think engineers are very prone to this because we like solving problems and leaving out the people aspect of it. So you can't do that with this. You really have to think about it. And so what is the answer? What do you do? How do you get that level of engagement up? Like, what is this, what do you do?
I'll answer that question, but I also want to tell my other extreme end of the spectrum story because this one always amuses me. Because I call it the GPS and dead end road syndrome, right? Which is you've all seen examples of someone uses a GPS and they get so reliant on the GPS that even when they're looking out the windshield of their car and they see road
Yeah.
closed ahead, do not, dead end, do not proceed, they drive down that road and off the end of the
Yeah.
road and into a lake, right?
Yeah.
And
Oh yes,
it's it,
yes,
yeah,
they do. I know.
it's happened enough that it's not even a
I
joke anymore.
I
It's right.
I know. I know.
Yeah.
It happens more than you realize it, which is kind of scary. I think people they check their brains and they don't use their brains to overcome what are obviously
Right.
things coming out of a tool or device that are wrong.
Yeah. So that obviously happens in AI too. People abdicate their own human judgment, their own thinking, and the opposite end of the spectrum from the person who rejects everything that they get from AI is the person who blindly accepts everything and doesn't view it through a critical lens of their own judgment and objective reality. And so either of those is bad. So back to your question about what do you do? Again, it's a multi-pronged approach. It's a process of number one, educating people in your organization, having people be taught a little bit about how AI works, what its limitations are,
Right.
what their realities are. We're not saying that everyone needs to be an AI engineer. That would obviously not be a practical solution, but people should be given access to some basic level of understanding about how these tools work, what they're good at, what they're not good at, where you would
Right.
rely on it. Number two is they need to understand that the more critical the output and the usage of the AI, the more skepticism or double checking is warranted, right? If I'm talking about driving a car, I'm sorry, there is no self driving tool out there today that is going to make me want to close my eyes and let the car drive itself. If I'm
Right.
using it for something simple like a search or summarizing a document, maybe I don't go back and check the sources and double check and validate. So the
Right.
context of how it's being used is super important and people need to be taught about that. But I think more generally, there's also a cultural phenomenon where you need to manage people's expectations. You need to acknowledge and understand their fears and their concerns, and you need to give them the critical thinking skills to use AI appropriately. And yeah, as an example, one of the things I'm a big believer in is every company that is doing AI should have some form of an AI code of conduct or a policy or a bill of rights or whatever is the
Right.
appropriate label put on it, right? But you as a leader in an organization should take the time to think about and write down and then hold yourself accountable to a set of guidelines about how will you use AI, how will you not use AI. For example, I would say I am not going to use AI in hiring decisions or promotion decisions. Those should be something that I might believe in my company should be purely based on my judgment, human judgment, and judgment from other people, right?
Right.
And I think you go a long way towards defusing some of the concerns if you can demystify how AI works and be very clear about the guardrails
Right.
you're putting in place and where you use it, where you won't, etc.
No, I think those are all awesome points, and I think you're spot on. One thing I want to comment on, because you've said it several times, is the importance of education. And I think having educated potential users is incredibly important. And I think, just going to somebody and say, oh, here's this new fancy AI tool that we're going to, help make you more efficient, you're going to hit a roadblock because they're not going to, look, in the worst case scenario, they're going to push back and make it fail intentionally, or they're certainly not going to use it. I think it's important that you bring individuals into the process as early as possible. And by I mean at ideation point of view, like at the very, very, very beginning, bring them in. I think that's important to make them feel like they're part of the solution and it's not just getting jammed down their throats. I also think it's important to understand to have, look, I like employees that are educated on these types of technologies more so than ever with this type of technology because it's so radically different. And having business users educated on the capabilities of these models and the limitations, I think, is only going to get you to a better place. Obviously, there's an investment in time to get people up to speed, but I'd rather have somebody who understands terminology behind some of these models, the capabilities, the limitations, in order for them to fully embrace it while we're coming up with a solution or we're ideating on potential solutions. That to me is incredibly important
Yep.
to do those types of things because you're going to get to a better place as
Yeah,
opposed to in the past in
absolutely.
the traditional. And well, you and I have worked in, organizations, our entire enterprise organizations, our entire life, where hey, we're the engineers. We got a brand new solution to make your life a little bit easier. It's go do it, and that worked for a lot in the past. It was easy.
Yeah.
That's not so true anymore.
I love your recommendation about including people from the beginning, from concept on, because that really helps with their education. It helps them see what the goals are and helps them steer the direction of these projects. So 100% agree with you there.
Right. And,
All right, let's move on to number 7 on our list, which is measure the impact. What does that mean to you, Peter?
and it's not just cost because that I actually think is the easy part of this. It's we had a question that popped up in the chat from one of the listeners about ROI on these models. I don't think it's easy always to measure ROI on any of this because a lot of it, honestly, it's putting a wet finger in the wind type of guess. You're trying to guess what it can be. There are real costs that you can measure. You can obviously measure the cost of running the model, the cost of implementation, engineering costs. Those things to me are tangible. Measuring the return to me is a little bit more difficult and something that you have to do, I think, over time. Um, I don't know, Dave. I'm struggling with an answer for this one. I think it's harder to measure the
Yeah.
impact. There's some things that's easy to measure the impact on. I think there are some things that are very clearly defined. The impact. Some are not so easy.
Right. And I think the trick to this is thinking broadly enough about the impact and understanding what the real world impact is. And so let me give you an example. Let's go back to a fictitious example of a company that maybe creates an internal AI chatbot that is designed to help customer service representatives answer customer phone calls and deal with their issues and questions, right? A potential metric that you might measure would be around accuracy or performance or usage of the tool by customer service reps. But if you measure just that, if that's as far as you go in assessing impact, you're missing some of the real world conventions. So you broaden your thinking a little bit. You say, okay, well, I'm also going to measure like call time. Has this brought down call time? Okay, that's great. That might be a reasonable goal, but you're still missing the real world impact, because yes, you might have brought down the duration of calls and you might have shortened the queues for a customer waiting for assistance, but you need to go further. You need to say, how do the customers feel about this? Does the customer
Right.
actually, are they more satisfied? Were they pleased by the interaction? Did this internal tool that I gave to my customer service rep actually translate into better outcomes for the customer? So we always preach, measure the real world impact. Don't just measure the performance metrics of the model or the performance of the business process you're supporting, like call duration. Measure the impact on people, on measurable processes. So when we
Right.
go back to ROI, I think the real answer is to the points that you raised earlier, Peter, around cost. Understand your real investment. It's not just your startup cost. It's not the engineering cost. It is the actual ongoing cost of maintaining, monitoring, and using this application or this solution. And on the returns side, it's really understand the real returns, the real impact that it's having, and quantify those. If you can measure customer satisfaction and your customer smile score increases by half a point, what is that worth to you? How does that translate into a tangible economic value? That's the ROI of this.
And I could not have said it better. I think that is so spot on. And it's those soft type of metrics that are always never measured, honestly. I think it's easier to get the people with the MBAs in the room and rattle off 57 metrics as to why this is better and why it's going to save you money. But if it's upsetting all your customers, internal and or external, then obviously there's no value there. And I go back. I'll use my simple example. I hate I hate cash registers without people. It drives me insane that I have to sit there and check out my own stuff. Not because I can't do it, because they are so error prone. Drives me nuts. Invariably, I walk out of every single store and I'm aggravated. That's not a good thing.
Yeah, and it's funny because then there are people from a generation that actually loves the cash registers, the self checkout lanes, because they don't have to talk to people and deal with people.
And I like
Um,
talking to people. So, hey,
yeah. Okay, so hopefully that is at least a partial answer to the query we had about quantifying ROI. I think that it's there's no simple formula for it, but I think it's really about capturing the full breadth of investment and the full breadth of return and impact, and being able to look beyond just the first order returns and the first order costs.
right,
Um,
right,
and
exactly.
yeah. Okay. So number 8 on our list, we're down to our penultimate item on the list. It's monitoring execution.
Right.
That's obviously is your cue to talk about ML ops and AI ops and things like that. So let's do that.
So I think it's important. So there's the easy things to measure, obviously, that are always easy. The traditional engineering metrics that you're going to measure. What does it cost? Is it scaling? Performance time? All that. I say it's easy because that stuff, the tooling is readily available. It's very easy to measure that stuff. It's the other things that are a little bit more complicated. Are the responses that I'm getting back degrading over time, for instance? Does the model need to be retuned because the information has changed over time? And I think those are the things you have to really look at closely because most models are going to degrade or change over time. They're not going to be static. Now, it really depends on the velocity of information and how fast that's changing. If your underlying information is changing very rapidly, for instance, the velocity is just very, very, very fast. Financial markets, for instance. Information's changing, every second. You're going to have to upgrade the models much more frequently. And you have to account for that. And you have to have an approach or a series of metrics that will measure your model, which will be unique to your domain, that will tell you if your model is degrading in performance and you need to update it on a regular basis. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about, and it's incredibly important. Now, maybe your information, it doesn't change often.
Right.
Maybe you're going to be
No, I
tuned
think
once a year.
that's a huge point. It is not, and for the foreseeable future will not be a set it and forget it type of things. And I think in a lot of cases we're used to traditional applications where once you compile your code and you promote that application to production, the behavior of the application is the behavior of the application, barring any unforeseen technical challenges and whatnot. But the application runs the same way tomorrow as it did today. And
Correct.
your point about model performance and outcomes may evolve over time as the stimulus changes, as the input changes, as the real world conditions change.
Right. And we learned this on traditional statistical models years ago.
Yeah.
When you're training a model, regression models, whatever, pick your model. Um, if you have some complex model, you're obviously training it on some set of information um, when you're training. Now, that information is going to change. You have to periodically go back and retune the models. Holds just as true for AI models. And I will consistently have home. It depends on the rate or the velocity of change. And that really is going to drive how often you're going to have to retrain some of these models. And you have to
Perfect.
factor that into your costs.
Yep. Yep. I think that's often overlooked, and it's sort of the hidden cost sometimes of deploying AI is people don't plan on the aftercare that's going to be required and the monitoring and things.
And I want to say one more thing, and I think it's important. And I think this is especially true with artificial intelligence models. Most don't, I think, extrapolate out to what it costs to run the model. Running these models in a production environment is typically much higher than running either traditional statistical models or just regular software packages. The costs are actually a lot higher, and you have to take that into account for a number of different reasons. None of we can go through, it's a whole other podcast. Um, there are ways to minimize it or control it, but you have to keep in mind the costs are going to be higher, most likely than what you think, and it's significantly
Now,
higher.
I don't want to scare people, right? Because the cost will be higher, and higher than what? Higher than the almost zero that you think it's going to be when you're playing around with the model very casually. I will also say, for most organizations, the costs are very worth it as long
I
as
got
they
yeah.
as long as they pick the right use cases, right? As long as they haven't thrown open the doors and said, "Hey, everybody, go create some AI models, and we'll see what happens." Right then, suddenly your costs are out of control. But
So, so now I think what you're saying is you need a business case. You should really treat this as a business case. And how do you do, what is the return on this investment for this particular application? So yes, maybe it costs, I don't know, 5 times more than running a regular application in production. But on the flip side of it is you're saving 100x as opposed to today, or you're going to make 100x more than you would. So the cost is actually significantly less. So you have to think about the whole picture. You have to look at it from beginning to end. It's not just solving a particular engineering problem. You're really solving something. You're solving a whole business case, business problem. So you really have to look at it from
let's
beginning to end.
let's make it personal. You and I both have signed up for a $200 a month pro tier of some
Right.
commonly available large language model. If you just said, I'm going to give everyone in my company access to this $200 a month tier, suddenly you're spending a lot of money because $200 is not pocket change. That's a big investment. But you and I both individually decided for the use cases that we use AI for, that $200 would have a multi-thousand-dollar return every month in terms of the time it saves us and the productivity benefits that we get. So, um,
Right. Right. And I think that's a very important point to hammer home. I mean, we both looked at it. I remember when I started using it initially, and we spoke later that day, and I'm like, David, you got to get this because the amount of time I did in an hour would have normally taken me 3 or 4 weeks of going over
yeah,
research and this and that and everything else. And instead, I got I'll call it, a 10,000 word dossier of information that was a phenomenal summarization of 50 different websites and other information that had pulled in, things that I honestly
yeah,
probably wouldn't have easily found. Now, mind you, I got to be careful and still go through it, but it saved me weeks of research and work.
yes, yes, absolutely. So that was our necessary coda on cost. But look, we have come to the end of the list. We have one more item on the list, and that is AI safety and ethics. We again could have an entire conversation about this. We will try not to do that right now, but suffice it to say, there are ethical and safety issues that you need to take into account and need to anticipate.
Yes. And again, it goes back to understanding what problem you're trying to solve. And, is this model going out to the public? Is it going to be used internal? But, and then you and I have spoken about controlling the information that goes into the model. It goes a long way towards controlling the output of the model. And I think that is something that is very important to keep in mind. But there are issues you need to be cognizant of potential issues that can happen with some of these models. They are statistical models at the end of the day, and you have to be aware.
Right.
So it is, and a lot of even the ethical concerns are highly subjective in nature and really dependent upon many cases of the domain that you're in, and you have to be aware of them.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to me. It's obviously, as you know, it's a field I spend a lot of time working on and
Right.
thinking about. And what's interesting is there are the actual harms that can be done if a model behaves in unpredictable ways. How can that create harm to people, to companies, to institutions, to trust in a broader sense, etc. But then there's also just the potential harms, whether the model's good or not, whether it behaves in the right way or not. There is a potential for reputational damage just because it's being used in a certain way. And so, as an example, if I tell people that we're building a very AI driven company, that we practice what we preach, and we're using a lot of AI to help drive our organization, and if someone starts to wonder if that means that I'm going out and again making hiring decisions based on AI, that might strike
Right.
someone as grossly unfair. And so that's an example of an ethical concern I would want to get ahead of, and I would want to have a very clear position on whether I would ever use AI to influence a hiring decision. And if so, how would I use it? Because there could be a reputational cost if someone thinks that we're being casual and careless about how we make those decisions.
Right.
So,
No, I
um,
and I think you're 110% correct. And and just taking even a step back a little, you know, you can't just look. These tools are powerful tools. We all know they're incredibly powerful tools, and they can do the work of knowledge workers in many cases. Can and should are two different things. Because you can doesn't mean you should. And also, you and I have spoken many times in the past about we'll call it augmented intelligence, using those to augment maybe somebody to make better decisions or faster decisions. But because a model can be used, doesn't mean it should be used. And I'll go, but we'll talk about HR for a second in the hiring process, which I can go on forever about. I am not a fan of using these models in hiring decisions, in HR hiring decisions. I think, they overlook a lot about an individual that an experienced manager would readily identify. I can look at a resume that would never get through an AI model and go, this person is fully qualified. And I think that is important. You don't want to have a machine make decisions for you that it shouldn't be making.
yeah. And your distinction between can and should is very, very important. It's one of the reasons that we chose the terms safety and ethics. Is this is not purely a legal distinction. There are a lot of things that you can do either technically and or legally that you still should not do. And I think a lot of the organizations that we talk to still are used to viewing things through maybe that legal lens. Is it permissible?
Mhm.
Do I
Right.
have privacy disclosures in place and policies in place? Is it legal to do? And they're not as accustomed to having to consider the softer factors of should I do it? And there is this dramatically shifting gray area between what is permissible and what is, I'll say, acceptable. And
And I
navigating
think
that can be tricky.
no, and it's funny. I think some of this is also partly generational. There's a generation now that's grown up in front of screens, I think, to a large degree, and they've lost that personal touch. They've lost that getting in front of people because there's so much lost. Like when you speak to somebody face to face versus sitting them on a screen, on a Zoom screen, there's so much information that you'll lose. I'm not a 2D representation. I mean, there's much about you don't know by seeing me on the screen. But when I meet a person face to face, when I'm speaking to them on the phone, it's all those subtle things that get lost. And I know we're going off on this a little bit of a tangent over here, And that goes back to could and should. Yes, I could use AI models. A lot of companies do use AI models in hiring decisions, right down to talk to a series of generated questions, and I'm going to judge your response on screen. I'm going to judge your your emotions, and I'm going to come back and tell the hiring manager all the stuff. I don't like that. I never have liked that. I think it's very deeply impersonal, and I think it's very damaging to a company's reputation. And I think it's also you miss out on a lot of great candidates because you're trying to make it easier to go through or call through 1,000 resumes. I again could and should are two different things. Could you? Yes. Should you? I don't think so. And I think you have to look at every problem in that light.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So, Peter, it has been another rapid fire 75 minutes. And as always, I learn something every time we have a conversation.
Same.
Let's recap what we talked about really quick. We talked about the fact that, there is a lot of hype in the AI market, but there's also real value. And we offered 9 key ideas to think about if you want to get that value. And
Right.
I'll run through the list real quick because those of you who joined late may want to go back and rewatch some early parts of the conversation. So we talked about make it unique. You've got to have an AI solution that incorporates the unique knowledge and attributes and characteristics of your business, your organization, yourself. 2, introduce your data. You can't create a unique solution without bringing your information, your knowledge, your data into it. Number 3, understand your data because it is not enough to have data. You've got to be able to get your hands on it. You've got to know if it's any good. You've got to deal with privacy and compliance and legal issues and many others. So understand your data and how to use it. Start small. Right. Don't boil the ocean. Start with a minimum viable product and test and learn and iterate. Model your costs because there will be unanticipated costs in using these models, and know where those inflection points are that would incent you to move to different approaches. Think about the cultural aspects, including the adoption and the willingness to rely on, or even the danger of over-reliance on AI models in your organization and help to mitigate that. Measure the real-world impact and focus on what you're measuring and measuring the right things. Monitor the execution, the behavior, and the ongoing performance of your models. And finally, don't forget about the safety and ethical issues. Focus on what should I do, not just what can I do.
Well said.
That was our whole conversation boiled down into 90 seconds. But
Yes.
Thank you again, Peter, for a great conversation. Thank you for the questions that you have submitted, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And again, please, feedback is always appreciated. We enjoyed the time. Dave and I speak for myself, I love doing this. I think this is awesome. And I look forward to doing more of these. Thank you, Dave, again. I do. Always learn a lot.
This has been Call Me Data, our fledgling podcast about all things data and AI. So thank you again, everyone, and see you next week.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Goodbye.